The World Bank has estimated Ukraine's economy will contract by 45% this year. 30% of Ukrainian businesses have ceased all activities. 9 million people have fled the country. And the Black Sea, which Ukraine used to export 50% of their goods, has been off limits to this point. Not to mention that war is expensive, and this conflict is stifling the Ukrainian economy. In this video, we'll discuss the importance international aid will play, as well as the 4 challenges that Ukraine must overcome to prevent total economic collapse. Ukraine is known as the breadbasket of Europe. Agriculture is at the heart of the Ukrainian economy and their exports. In 2020, Ukraine exported $24.9 billion worth of agricultural products. That's 47% of their total exports. And Ukraine ranks in the top 10 worldwide in production of corn, wheat, potatoes, sunflower seeds, and barley. Agriculture is not only a vital part of the Ukrainian economy, but many countries in the Middle East and Africa rely heavily on this Ukrainian grain. That's why, as you know by now, this is creating a potential food crisis, which is a different topic for another video. On the positive side, despite this war, Ukrainian farmers still managed to plant 80% of the expected crops. Now, fall is harvest season, and if they're able to get a good yield with what was planted, that will be a huge boost for the Ukrainian economy. But that will lead right into challenge number 2, and how will they export these goods? 50% of Ukrainian exports go through the port of Odessa, which till this point has been closed. But great news coming this past week that Ukraine and Russia, with the help of Turkey and the UN, managed to negotiate an agreement that will open up the Black Sea for Ukrainian ships exporting grain. And this is a great first step, that a deal is now in place. However, there are still some things that could go wrong. The next step is for Ukraine to demine the ports, which could take up to a couple of months. But once the ports are open and traffic is flowing, I think it's unlikely that Russia will attack these grain ships. However, if Russia starts making progression in the south and gets closer to Odessa, they could use these demined ports to launch an amphibious assault. That's why it's so important that Ukraine defend this area in the south and prevent Russia from getting near Odessa. And to this point, they've done a good job defending Mykolaiv and then gaining back area towards Kherson. But until the Black Sea is open up, they're forced to use alternative methods of transportation through countries like Poland and Romania. And this is problematic for several reasons. First, due to EU bureaucracy, there's limits on how many lorries can cross the Ukrainian border into the EU. And even if they were to relax these limits, still the roads wouldn't be able to handle the traffic. Also, Poland has opened up their ports for Ukrainian exports. However, getting these goods to Poland is one challenge, and then shipping them through the Baltic Sea as opposed to the Black Sea is quite inefficient. And there are Romanian ports in the Black Sea. However, these ports do not have the excess capacity to handle this amount of goods. That's why solving this Black Sea access for Ukraine is critical to helping them overcome these economic hardships. The first part of this is the refugee crisis, as 9 million Ukrainians have fled the country and another 8 million are internally displaced. And this is absolutely terrible for the economy. I mean, some of these people were working prior to the war, and now their lives have been turned upside down and they have to focus on survival and getting their families out. And that has led to 30% of businesses shutting in Ukraine and many more scaling back operations. There's a hope that possibly the safer areas in western Ukraine will pick up some of the slack for the areas that have been more deeply impacted from this war. And the second part deals with the land. And this is kind of obvious. Less land means less opportunities for economic activity. 20 to 25% of Ukrainian territory is now under the control of Russia. And the economic activity within this area is now likely under the control of Russia. Take the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, for example, which Russia took over. They're now selling energy from this plant to Ukraine, and Ukraine fears if they stop paying that Russia will reroute this energy back to Russia. And also to mention, Russia's using this nuclear power plant as a makeshift war base, which is concerning to many people that a nuclear power plant may not be the best place to store ammunition and conduct a war from. But on a positive note, much of the area gains that Russia have made since the 2014 control line are not incredibly vital areas to the Ukrainian economy. And moving forward, it's key that Ukraine defends areas that are vital to their economy, like Kiev, the industrial city of Kharkiv, and the port of Odessa. It's clear that Ukraine's economy will be significantly impacted from this war. However, it's unclear to economists to what degree they will be impacted. And a large part of that will depend on how well they manage these first three challenges to salvage as much revenue as possible, as well as challenge number 4. War is expensive, and Ukraine is burning through money financing this war, all while their revenues are cut significantly. Military salaries are costing the Ukrainian government $5 billion a month. Annually, that's 39% of pre-war GDP. And printing more money is not an option because inflation's at 21%. So the Ukrainian government issued what's been dubbed as war bonds to help finance these expenditures with international investment. However, the problem with these bonds is their yield is only 11%, which lags well behind the inflation rate. Given this current environment, this war is unsustainable. For Ukraine to continue to wage their defense against Russia while maintaining the well-being of their citizens at just the most basic level, it's impossible for them to do it alone. To finance this war, Ukraine will need to have help from abroad. If the money runs out in Ukraine, they'll lose the ability to pay their soldiers, they won't be able to pay any pensions, and they will soon begin defaulting on foreign debt. And then they'll no longer be able to afford to import goods, which will lead to shortages of food and essential goods across the economy. At this point, Ukraine will be in a state of total economic collapse, and therefore would be at the mercy of Russia and be forced to accept an unfavorable deal. That is one of the strategies of the invader: total economic suffocation. Support will largely come from the United States, the European Union, and possibly the IMF. Fortunately for Ukraine, the EU has a vested interest in Ukraine. Ukrainian parts sustain German factories, and their grain feeds the world. And if this conflict gets any worse, that will send more refugees into the European Union. Ursula von der Leyen summed it up by saying that Europe has a special responsibility toward Ukraine and must send massive investment to sustain it. Now let's talk numbers. Ukraine declared that they need $5 billion per month to sustain military salaries, pension, and just basic public services. And this was right in line with the IMF's estimate. And so far today, the US Congress has approved a $40 billion aid package, $8.5 billion which is earmarked for economic aid. And the EU has promised 9 billion euros in economic aid, but has only disbursed 1 billion euros to date due to disagreements amongst the EU member states regarding the rest of the aid package. And the UK has given roughly $2 billion while Canada has given $750 million. In total, that's $20 billion of economic aid. And then drawing back to the Ukrainian estimate of needing $5 billion per month, this economic aid will only last a few months. That's why it's so important that Ukraine salvage as much economic activity as possible and then bridge the gap with foreign aid. It's clear that time is not on the Ukrainian side, and the longer this war drags on, the more it will hurt economic activity, and then that will eventually take its toll on the battlefield.